Era dos Mortadelas, estamos entrando aqui mais com um corte, com mais um corte para você. E hoje eu trouxe esse velhinho aqui, que, porra, eu amo ele, cara. É o Chon, é o tio Chon. Ali, o livro dele ali, ó. Então, ó, para você que não conhece, Noam Chomsky é um dos, porra, um dos maiores, é o maior intelectual vivo. Ele já foi considerado o maior intelectual vivo algumas vezes, só nesse século. Ele é um ativista político, mas ele é um linguista, um cientista político e um ativista. Ele se identifica como um ativista. Inclusive, a gente vai ver um vídeo dele falando sobre ativismo, mas hoje eu trouxe esse daqui, que é o quê? Chomsky, sobre Lenin, Trotsky, socialismo e União Soviética. Por que eu trouxe esse vídeo aqui? Esse vídeo, ele vai falar sobre esses temas, obviamente, mas ele vai estar respondendo às críticas de uma pessoa que estava na palestra dele, que provavelmente, quer dizer, com certeza é de esquerda pelo discurso, mas, como vocês sabem, na esquerda existem milhões de tipos de esquerda, e aí apareceu aqui na plateia uma crítica ao Chomsky e jogou na cara dele as críticas e vamos ver como é que ele reagiu. Então a gente já vai aproveitar e já fazer vários apanhados. Como é que se responde a uma crítica? O que é um debate acadêmico, intelectual? Como se dão os debates dentro da esquerda? É importantíssimo que a gente fale isso, porque no Brasil a esquerda não parece que não sabe conversar com ela mesma, né? A gente só sabe brigar e ninguém sabe debater. Então, para você que está querendo saber como é que faz para debater dentro da esquerda, para discordar de um companheiro, tá aqui um exemplo para você. Vamos assistir o Chon.
A ruling class which tries to control a working class population, and that's what it's about, is holding on to that power. If that's the case, then it seems like to me the question that we face is how to organize to change that system, to challenge capitalism. And I think in that effort, you do a disservice to your listeners and to the people who respect your work when you equate Lenin with Stalinism as blithely as you did tonight. I say that, and I think it's also important to point out that that is an unquestioned assumption and also an easy applause getter we saw that you share with the mainstream media. And I think if it were actually that simple, the horrific kinds of measures that even bourgeois historians describe as a counter-revolution under Stalin would not have been necessary if they were all the same to begin with. Now, in short, to sum up, the situation that you have outlined tonight, I think, is extremely serious, and I think it's important that we all take it seriously. What we're talking about is literally the fate of millions of lives around the world, particularly in the international politics that you described. That being the case, then I think we need a full and a serious and a fair discussion of various different alternatives, not just talking about the horrors of capitalism, but actually how to change it to end this stuff once and for all.
Well, I think you made, yeah.
Vamos ver como é que ele responde a crítica de uma esquerdista, né?
I think, well, there's several questions there. One is about the discussion of the United States, and I think what I said is approximately what you said, except I didn't use some of that rhetoric. Which I don't think is particularly helpful to tell you the truth, either analytically or to understand or whatever. It doesn't bother me if I happen to agree with the mainstream media on this. Trotsky, to pick somebody who you remember, once he was charged in the 1930s with agreeing with the fascists in his condemnation of the Soviet Union. And he pointed out that his critique was to be true. He wasn't going to abandon it if somebody else happened to say it for different reasons. So the question is about the Soviet Union, and particularly about Lenin. So what was Leninism? Well, here we have to look at the facts. Now, you look at the facts, I think here's what you find. Lenin was a right-wing deviation of the socialist movement, and he was so regarded. He was regarded as that by the Marxists, by the mainstream Marxists. We've forgotten who the mainstream Marxists were because they lost, and you only remember the guys who won. But if you go back to that period, the mainstream Marxists were people like, for example, Anton Pannekoek, who was head of education for the Marxist movement, and he's one of the people who Lenin later denounced as an infantile leftist. But he was one of the leading intellectuals of the actual Marxist movement. Rosa Luxemburg was another mainstream Marxist, and there were others. And they were very critical. In fact, Trotsky was one up until 1917. They were all very critical of Leninism because of this, what they regarded as this opportunistic vanguardism. The idea that the radical intelligentsia were going to exploit popular movements to seize state power and then to use that state power to whip the population into the society that they chose. Now, that was quite inconsistent with Marxism as understood by the mainstream sort of, I'd say, left Marxists. From this point of view, Bolshevism was a right-wing deviation. Trotsky made the same points up till 1917. Now, when Lenin came back to Russia in April 1917, he took a different line, quite a different line from the one he'd had in the past. You take a look at Lenin's work, it shifted character in April 17. In April 1917, it became kind of libertarian. That's when he came out with the April Theses, and that's when he wrote State and Democracy. It came out a year later, but that's when it was written. And these were State and Revolution. These were basically libertarian works. They were very much more in the mainstream of sort of left libertarian socialism, from sort of this range that goes from anarchism over to left Marxism of the Pannekoek-Luxemburg variety. And he talked about Soviets and the need for a workers' organization and so on. In fact, came really closer to what the essence of socialism was always understood to be. After all, the core of socialism was understood to be workers' control over production. That was the core. It's where you begin with. Then you go on to other things. But the beginning is control by the workers over production. That's where it begins. Then Lenin took power in October 1917 in what's called a revolution, but in my view ought to be called a coup. And things followed that coup, or revolution, if you want to call it that. One of the things that followed it was the immediate moves to destroy the Soviets and the factory councils. Those were some of the first moves of Lenin and Trotsky after they took, Trotsky joined at that point, after they took state power. In fact, if you look at what Lenin wrote after that period, or did, you'll find it's a reversion to the earlier position. This sort of left deviation is that, a deviation. You could ask why. In my view, it was just opportunistic. He knew that in order to gain power, he was going to have to go along with the popular currents that were developing, which were in fact spontaneous and libertarian and socialist, as most popular movements have been, in fact, since the 17th century. And being an astute politician, which he was, he sort of went along with that and talked the line that the people wanted to hear. It's just like when an American politician goes somewhere and his pollsters tell him, say so-and-so, and he says it, meaning he believes it. And I think Lenin was doing the same thing without polls. In any event, whatever your interpretation is, when he took power, he reverted to the former vanguardism and moved at once to eliminate the organs of workers' control. Now that meant he was moving to destroy socialism, if socialism has as its core workers' control over production. The Soviets and the factory councils were instruments of workers' control. And same, you could say they're defective instruments, that we worked out better and so on, yeah, no doubt. But they were the instruments that had been developed in the course of popular struggle to implement basically workers' control, and those were the first things to go. By early 1918, this is now, it's still really before the Civil War set in, Lenin's view was pretty clearly expressed. It was the view that both he and Trotsky took the position that what you need is what Trotsky called a labor army, which is submissive to the control of a single leader. He said modern progress and development and socialism requires that the mass of the population subordinate themselves to a single leader in a disciplined workforce. Well, that has absolutely nothing to do with socialism. In fact, it's the exact opposite of it, and was criticized for that by in a spirit of some solidarity, because the revolutionary forces were still operative. He was criticized for that by people like Rosa Luxemburg and by Pannekoek and Gorter and the other mainstream sort of left Marxists, and I think they were right. It seems to me that, and then it just goes on from there. I mean, Lenin reconstructed the czarist systems of oppression often more efficiently, Cheka, KGB, and other techniques of control and oppression. I think from that point on, there was nothing remotely like socialism in the Soviet Union. I think it was, in fact, in my view, as a precursor of later forms of totalitarianism. Now, you could, that's what I think happened. I think that's what you discover if you look at the facts. Now, why is it called socialism? Well, I think I think that's complicated, and we should look at it. There's the Soviet Union calls it socialism.
Vou parar aqui rapidão.
And after they took control of the.
Ele vai discutir agora por que então na visão do Chomsky, a União Soviética, após assumir o poder através de Lenin, que foi a Revolução Russa, Lenin e Trotsky. Porém, você pode chamar de revolução, você pode chamar de golpe, porque a família real russa foi assassinada, né? Vocês sabem disso. Então, para todos os efeitos, foi um golpe. Agora, você pode chamar de golpe ou de revolução. Isso aí são interpretações históricas. É claro que foi uma revolução. É claro. Não vou aqui negar que foi uma revolução. Mas isso aí são conceitos políticos. O mesmo fato pode ter dois vieses. As pessoas não chamam o golpe militar do Brasil de revolução até hoje? Esses velhos fudidos aí? Pois é. Então Chomsky chamava a União Soviética de um sistema totalitarista que não se aproximava do socialismo, porque, segundo ele, o socialismo é o controle pelos trabalhadores. E tanto que Trotsky criticou muito Lenin, tanto que foi perseguido e morto por isso. Porque viu que Lenin remontou os sistemas de opressão czaristas, que foi o que eles derrubaram em primeiro lugar, para implantar o socialismo, a União Soviética. Segundo Chomsky, não é o socialismo. Mas isso aí são debates. Eu quero trazer para vocês aqui exatamente isso. Deixei de ser comunista por causa disso? Não. De forma alguma. Até porque a gente não tem que copiar fórmula pronta de nada. O marxista é aquele que olha as condições materiais e analisa a partir do que elas são, não do que você gostaria de ser. É aí que a gente se diferencia dos marxistas utópicos, dos socialistas utópicos. Marxista utópico não tem. O marxismo ele é um sistema de análise que é científico, né? O marxismo científico, por isso que é a ciência imortal do proletariado. Então vamos ver aqui, ó, o que o Chomsky vai falar sobre a União Soviética ser ou não socialista.
They did take control pretty soon of most of the international socialist movement, because primarily the prestige of having created something sort of socialism. Incidentally, just a side remark, Lenin remained, despite it all, a sort of an orthodox Marxist in many respects. And as an orthodox Marxist, he didn't believe that it was possible to have socialism in the Soviet Union. This was supposed to be up to his death, or shortly before his death, when he was still writing, speaking lucidly, he kept the view that the Soviet revolution was a holding action. They were just going to hold things in place until the real revolution took place in Germany, because the revolution, according to Marxist doctrine, was going to take place in the most advanced sector of modern industrial capitalism, for all the reasons that you read about in Marx. That's where the revolution had to take place. Obviously, that wasn't the Soviet Union, so there couldn't be socialism there. It was just some kind of holding action. And that presumably gave some sort of justification for eliminating the socialist institutions. I don't think it's a real justification, but probably that was the internal justification. And again, in taking that view, he was in accord with the mainstream Marxist tradition. Well, after that comes the view that all of this is socialism. And why should the communist parties take that view? I think the reason is because they wanted to sort of exploit the moral force of socialism, which was quite real. It's kind of hard to remember that today, but at that time it was very real. This was regarded as a, as a progressive moral force, and by associating their own destruction of socialism with the aura of socialism, they hoped to gain credit in the working classes and other progressive sectors. Now, the West also identified that with socialism, and they did it for the opposite reason. They wanted to associate socialism with the brutality of the Russian state that undermined socialism. So what you had is that the two major world propaganda agencies, for their own quite different reasons, were claiming that this is socialism, that this destruction of socialism is socialism. And it's very hard to break out of the control of the world's two major propaganda agencies when they agree. They agreed for different reasons, but they basically agreed, and that then became doctrine and dogma. Well, I think people should ask whether that's true. Take a look back and see whether the moves that Lenin took and that Trotsky supported him in taking and that they both advocated had anything to do with socialism as it was understood by, say, in the Marxist tradition or in the left libertarian tradition.
É isso. Tá aí, tchon para vocês. A gente pode ver mais vídeos dele. Tem um vídeo dele aqui maneiro com o Eduardo Moreira, uma entrevista. Mas tá aí para vocês verem que esse é um dos debates que existe dentro da esquerda. Tá ligado? Deixa eu ler aqui. Você precisa se candidatar com essa energia. Temos que mostrar que a juventude brasileira não tem só chupetas de merda. Aquele filhote de filho da puta precisa de contestação. Bota fé, irmão, mas a minha luta é aqui na mídia. Eu quero ser o Olavo de Carvalho da esquerda. O Olavo de Carvalho da esquerda no sentido bom, né? De trazer aqui os debates, de movimentar o campo intelectual da esquerda e, claro, a militância. Eu sou um ativista. Por isso que o Chom, como você falou aqui, é um ídolo. É uma mente brilhante. E o que a gente faz com mentes brilhantes? A gente se ilumina, tá ligado? A gente reflete. A gente pega esse conhecimento e, ó, fica aqui, ó, discutindo, tá ligado? É assim que se faz política. Agora, não adianta só ficar nessa punheta aqui ideológica se a gente não for para a linha de frente, como o amigo aqui está falando. Mas, para mim, a minha linha de frente, mais importante do que pegar um cargo público aí e tal, é fazer o debate aqui, no campo da internet. Por isso que nós estamos voltando, nós estamos há 10 anos fazendo isso aqui, há mais de 10 anos que tem essa página, mas agora que eu estou tendo tempo para poder me dedicar aqui e investir. Então, para você que quer me ajudar nesse trabalho, pode ir lá no apoia.se, que é melhor do que um voto, tá? Mas estamos juntos. Obrigado aí pela força. A gente apoia muitos políticos, tá? A gente não fica aqui queimando política institucional, falando que política é tudo vagabundo, ladrão, não. Aqui não tem o denismo, não. Tanto que a gente é parceiro de vários e apoia vários políticos aí do campo da esquerda. Glauber Braga, Sâmia, a Erika Hilton, Henrique Vieira. E vamos nessa. Boulos. Estamos junto aí do campo. Não estamos aqui para ficar atacando pedra, não. Estamos aqui para construir. E é por isso que eu trouxe esse vídeo aqui, para vocês verem que existe debate, existe como ter um debate inteligente dentro da esquerda, existe como discordar, tá ligado? A gente tem que aprender a voltar a saber discordar, gente. A gente não está sabendo mais conversar por conta dessa polarização doente, né? Mas estamos aí para isso, então estamos juntos. Você que está aqui nos acompanhando, fica aí no canal, se inscreve no canal que está vindo mais cortes para vocês. Nós continuamos aqui na Twitch ao vivo o dia inteiro, tá? Live todo dia,